When it comes to bad luck, there are few superstitions as pervasive in Western culture as that of Friday the 13th. Like crossing paths with a black cat and breaking a mirror, the notion of a day that can bring misfortune is deeply embedded, even if believers can't quite explain why. There's even a name to describe the irrational dread of the date: paraskevodecatriophobia, a specialised form of triskaidekaphobia, a fear of the number 13. While Friday the 13th may feel like a rare phenomenon, our Gregorian calendar means that the 13th of any month is slightly more likely to fall on a Friday than any other day of the week. It is not, however, a universal superstition. In Greece and Spanish-speaking countries, it is Tuesday the 13th that is considered a day of bad luck, while in Italy it is Friday the 17th that is met with fear. In biblical tradition, the concept of unlucky Fridays stretches back even further than the crucifixion. Friday is said to be the day that Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge, the day Cain murdered his brother Abel, the day the Temple of Solomon was toppled, and the day Noah's Ark set sail in the Great Flood. In 1907, the publication of Thomas W. Lawson's popular novel Friday the 13th captured the imagination with its tale of an unscrupulous broker who took advantage of the superstitions around the date to deliberately crash the stock market. Fast forward to the 1980s, and a hockey-masked killer by the name of Jason Voorhees in the slasher flick franchise Friday the 13th ensured notoriety. Then came Dan Brown's 2003 novel The Da Vinci Code, which helped popularise the incorrect claim that the superstition originated with the arrests of hundreds of members of the Knights Templar on Friday, October 13th, 1307. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, officers of King Philip IV of France arrested hundreds of the powerful Knights Templar, a religious and military order formed in the 12th century for the defence of the Holy Land. Imprisoned because the king wanted access to their financial resources, many Templars were later executed. Some cite this as the origin of the Friday the 13th superstition, but like many legends in history, the truth remains murky. In more recent times, a number of traumatic events have occurred on Friday the 13th. Perhaps Friday the 13th wasn't the best day to stage a leap into New York's Genesee River. But then again, concern over the date may never have occurred to Sam Patch. Patch, who was born around 1800, lived before Friday the 13th superstitions were prevalent. They probably emerged closer to the end of the 1800s, or at least that's when folklorists find the first written records. A child mill worker, Patch would get an adrenaline rush by leaping off of mill dams, a talent he eventually spun into public stunt shows for cash. The Niagara Leap made him a national name. Less than a month later, however, Patch arrived in Rochester half drunk. What happened next is lost to history, but an 1883 article in the New York Times reported that Patch did not retain the position while descending or strike the water, as he did on the former occasion, when he had previously made a similar jump. Whatever occurred, the Friday the 13th leap was Patch's last. In 1939, a bushfire tore through Australia's Victoria province, killing 36 people in one day. This Black Friday fire was the deadly icing on top of a terrible fire season for the province. According to Australian Emergency Management, a total of 71 people died that January, and 75% of the state was affected by the flames. All told, about 300 buildings, including 700 homes, were destroyed in the January blazes. During World War II, Nazi Germany began an intensive bombing campaign against the United Kingdom, targeting London in particular. On 16 occasions, Buckingham Palace itself was hit. According to the City of Westminster Archives Centre, one of the most destructive of these hits occurred on a Friday the 13th. 5 bombs struck the palace, one of which destroyed the interior of the royal chapel. Another ruptured a water main. 3 people were injured, 1 fatally. Additional bombings would follow, but the palace survived the war with only slight damage. July 13th, 1951 was an extremely inauspicious day for northeastern Kansas. The rains had been coming down hard and heavy since July 9th, bringing up to 16 inches, or 40 centimetres, of precipitation to the Kansas, Neosho, Verdigris and Murray des Cygnes rivers. In Topeka, the Kansas River rose to 40.8 feet, or 12.4 metres, which was 6 feet, or 1.8 metres, higher than any flood ever measured to that date, according to the National Weather Service. Topeka was swamped, as was Lawrence. It was the single worst day of flood destruction in the Midwest to that date. 28 people died, and another 500,000 were displaced until the waters receded. Officials estimate the damage amounted to $935 million at the time, which is equivalent to $6.4 billion in today's dollars. On Friday, June 13, 1952, the Cold War turned hot when the Soviet Union shot down a Swedish military transport plane. 8 people were on board the plane, which the Swedish government insisted was merely on a training flight. For its part, the Soviet Union declared it had no involvement in shooting down the lost plane. However, a life raft with shrapnel damage was found during the search for the wreckage, and one of the rescue planes was shot down by Soviet fighters mere days after the first disappeared. Almost 40 years later, Swedish officials admitted that the plane was a spy plane. Likewise, in 1991, the Soviet Union admitted to shooting the plane down. In 2003, the wreckage of the lost plane was found on the floor of the Baltic Sea. 4 crew members were identified, but the other 4 remain missing. On March 13, 1964, bar manager Kitty Genovese was stabbed and assaulted by a stranger named Winston Moseley. The attack took more than a half hour, and an early New York Times article reported that 38 people witnessed the attack and failed to call the police. The tragic case became a staple in psychology classes as a way to illustrate the bystander effect, which occurs when people fail to act in a situation because they assume someone else will step in. The story appears to be more complicated, however. Subsequent journalistic investigations revealed that this initial article inflated the number of witnesses and the number of attacks, and that it mistakenly claimed that Genovese was already dead by the time ambulances arrived. Several witnesses did see parts of the attack and turned away, but most did not understand the gravity of the situation, or did intervene, albeit not quick enough to save Genovese's life. Shifting to 1970, the deadliest tropical cyclone in history struck Bangladesh. Making landfall that Thursday night, the Bola cyclone killed at least 300,000 people. The storm was equivalent to a Category 3 hurricane, with sustained winds of 115 miles per hour, or 185 kilometers per hour. Even more devastating was the storm surge, which pushed the ocean water up to 16 feet, or 5 meters high. With nowhere to evacuate to, people climbed trees to escape the rising waters. Many were swept away. The highest survival rate was that for adult males aged 15 to 49, researchers reported in a 1972 article, which is consistent with the impression that those too weak to cling to trees were selectively lost in the storm. On Friday the 13th in October 1972, the Uruguayan Old Christians Club rugby team boarded a turboprop plane to travel to a match in Chile. They never made it. Because of a navigational error, the plane careened into an Andean mountain peak, crashing on a high-altitude snowfield. But the ordeal was only the beginning for 27 of the original 45 passengers who survived the crash and its immediate aftermath. Without cold weather gear or much food, they were forced to improvise water-melting devices and eventually eat from the bodies of their lost companions, an ordeal memorialised in the 1974 book and 1993 movie Alive. An avalanche killed 8 more survivors at the end of October, and illness took the lives of others. Incredibly, rescue did not come until the end of December, after 2 survivors launched a death-defying effort to hike out of the rugged terrain for help. The last of the 16 survivors were rescued after 72 days in the frigid wilderness. According to a statistical analysis by the Aviation Safety Network, superstitious passengers need not worry about flying on Friday the 13th. The unlucky day is no more prone to plane crashes than any other. In fact, the overall rate of fatal crashes on Friday the 13th is lower than the average of all days. But October 13th, 1972 was not a great day to fly. The same day the turboprop plane carrying the rugby team went down in the Andes, a much larger flight crashed near Moscow's Sheremetyevo airport in Russia. The airplane was carrying 164 passengers and 10 crew members from Paris to Moscow, with a stop in Leningrad. As the plane approached the airport, it flew into the ground at an airspeed of 620 kilometers per hour, and everyone on board was killed. The cause of the accident was never determined. Mechanical malfunction is one possibility, or the pilot may have lost control due to a lightning strike. Friday, September 13, 1996, was a tragic day for hip-hop when rapper Tupac Shakur died of gunshot injuries in a Las Vegas hospital. Shakur had been injured on September 7th in a still unsolved drive-by shooting and died from those injuries on Friday the 13th. Theories on the ultimate motive for the murder quickly proliferated. Business disputes, personal feuds, gang violence. Some die-hard conspiracy theorists refuse to believe that Shakur really died and insist that he is still alive somewhere, in hiding. Residents of Buffalo, New York have come to expect a lot of snow in the winter months, but 22 inches, or 56 centimetres, in the middle of October. That was the snowfall total recorded at the Buffalo airport on October 13th, 2006, during the Friday the 13th blizzard. The snow that fell on Buffalo and upstate New York starting that Thursday afternoon and continuing into Friday was heavy and wet, and because the trees had not yet lost their leaves, branches snapped like matchsticks under the combined weight. Almost 1 million people lost power for up to a week because of the storm. On January 13, 2012, a peaceful Friday of cruising off the Tuscan coast turned chaotic as the Costa Concordia cruise ship struck a reef and began to tilt. At first, passengers were evacuated by lifeboat, but as the ship came to rest on its side in the shallow water, survivors had to be airlifted to shore by helicopter. 32 people died in the wreck. A massive salvage operation took 19 hours to raise the ship from the reef where it came to rest. The captain of the ship was arrested for manslaughter and for abandoning the ship instead of directing the evacuation. In the late 19th century, a New Yorker named Captain William Fowler sought to remove the enduring stigma surrounding the number 13, and particularly the unwritten rule about not having 13 guests at a dinner table, by founding an exclusive society called the 13 Club. The group dined regularly on the 13th day of the month in room 13 of the Knickerbocker Cottage, a popular watering hole Fowler owned from 1863 to 1883. Before sitting down for a 13-course dinner, members would pass beneath a ladder and a banner reading Morituri te salutamus, Latin for those of us who are about to die salute you. 4 former US presidents would join the 13 Club's ranks at one time or another. Given the mass of doom-laden lore, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Friday the 13th is indeed ominous, but perhaps the narrative of this unlucky date, and the female deities associated with it, might soon be rewritten.